Hello, I'm Charlotte Leisman. Welcome to the Gothic Literary Society. Today is actually Horror Dark Fantasy Friday, so we are going to do something a little bit different. We're actually not looking at an explicitly Gothic book per se. We're looking at something that is categorized as horror or dark fantasy. Today it's categorized as horror, and we're going to examine whether we agree with that and how maybe it differs from the Gothic genre. So I wanted to do this, the Horror Dark Fantasy Friday, for several different reasons. First of all, most of us who love Gothic writing also enjoy horror. Second, I wanted to introduce ourselves to our horror and dark fantasy loving cousins. They are a fairly close genre to our own in some respects, which we'll talk more about in other videos. And third, I just thought it would be really fun for us to explore the differences and to appreciate more about this genre and perhaps to appreciate Gothic more as well, just by understanding how it is similar and or different from horror or dark fantasy. So for this Friday, I chose to take a look at Justin Cronin's book, The Passage. It was a TV show, one season. Unfortunately, it didn't continue because this is actually a very compelling and interesting book. And it's not categorized as Gothic, but let's talk about what we think about it. I highly recommend Justin Cronin's writing. His voice is very, very elegant. It has a quality of literary fiction, and yet underneath it all, it's a very dark story. So strong plot, strong character, strong theme, strong everything. I highly recommend it. So what is this book about? Well, basically, this is a U.S. government / military experiment gone wrong, and in the end, a number of death row inmates are converted to virals, which is Cronin's version of a vampire. They break out and run rampage throughout the entire world, kill most of the people, and then one young girl is humanity's only hope for survival. So that is the story in a nutshell. So unlike our Gothic book reviews, in this video we are going to avoid giving away the things that perhaps would ruin the story for you. So feel free to stay with us and you can decide whether you want to check this out for yourself. So why is or isn't it Gothic? So if you've seen my video, What is Gothic Lit, or you've read my article over at my author website, charlotteleisman.com, I talk about things like irrational themes. So irrational themes are those that put forth very often spiritual or psychological questions. Okay, so what is the theme in the passage? Well, Cronin has actually said he believes it is about what is worth fighting for. So essentially, what is beautiful in the world? What are the relationships that are worth saving? What are the people worth fighting for? Those kinds of things. I definitely see that throughout the book. I actually think there is more going on than just that. So there is definitely a theme of what is called a secret sin in writing communities. If you've read a lot of craft books, you know that in some genres the characters are suffering from a secret sin, either their own or a close character's secret sin or a larger community's secret sin. And in this case, it of course is the government as a whole. So the government has attempted to create these superhumans. So basically the US military was trying to create this powerful military force that just couldn't be vanquished by anyone or anything. And in doing so, they ended up basically destroying the entire world. So if we were to summarize it, I would say this theme is really, it's something of a Frankenstein sort of theme taken to a different level. It's like Frankenstein mixed with Stephen King's The Stand. So essentially, when man tries to play God, the results are destructive. That would be what Mary Shelley was putting forth. Here we have a slightly different variation. So the idea is that the superhuman is so much more destructive and horrific that the world is better off with the fragile, imperfect human being. And Cronin proves that throughout just by focusing so much on the imperfect beauty of fragile, ordinary human relationships and individual characters who are in every way imperfect and yet lovely people. So essentially, you have a theme that is definitely not a Gothic theme. It is definitely along the lines of what we call horror. So horror themes deal with that secret sin issue. So do dark fantasy, but we'll visit that in a moment and decide which we think it is. So what are the Gothic tropes? Well, on the surface, of course, the most dominant one is the vampire. It would be really easy to read this and just assume that this is a Gothic book because there are vampires, which is partly why I wanted to talk about it today, because this is a really good example of why a book with something that appears to be Gothic on the surface is not necessarily a Gothic book. So in a Gothic book, the tropes have to support a Gothic theme. We've already said we don't think the theme is particularly Gothic, but the tropes here also, how are they working? So in a Gothic book, and we looked at this in a video recently on using vampires to enhance theme. I talked about Dracula, I talked about Anne Rice's book, Interview with the Vampire, and in those books we talked about how the vampires are used very symbolically to support very Gothic themes. Well, in Cronin's book, the vampires, or virals as he calls them, for as interesting as they don't necessarily play a symbolic role related to the theme at all. For all practical purposes, the virals are nothing but monstrous beasts. They're not really the tormented souls you see in the Interview with the Vampire or the Vampire Lestat or any number of Anne Rice's books. So you have this Gothic trope that appears to make this a Gothic book, and yet it's really not, because it's not playing any thematic role. So that's why I would call this more of a horror or dark fantasy. So you don't really have a Gothic theme, and you have a trope that appears to be Gothic but really isn't functioning like a Gothic trope. So which is it? Is it horror or is it dark fantasy? So what do you think? And the answer is not really that easy, because you could go either way. So dark fantasy is horror mixed with fantasy. Dark fantasy generally does not take place in a real world setting, whereas the passage does. But horror very often doesn't employ as many fantastical elements as dark fantasy does. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So you really honestly could go either way with this. I tend to think that I might choose dark fantasy, and the reason why is because, so if you were to take this story and you placed it in a fantasy setting, you would essentially have the exact same story. But if you took the virals out of the book, you would have an entirely different story. So in that sense, the vampires are playing a much stronger purpose in this book than the setting is, which makes me think I would be more inclined to categorize it as dark fantasy. However, the industry has categorized it as horror. I don't always agree with everything they do. However, let me know what you think about it. So that's it for today. Let me know what you thought of this book if you've read it, and whether you think it's horror or dark fantasy, or how you would liken it to the Gothic sphere. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to ring that bell and subscribe to my channel. I post videos every Friday. So until next time, stay undead, my friends.